Welcome to the Kappan Centenary Public Lecture titled Re-Enchanting Democracy, Reclaiming the Public by Professor Yogendra Yadav. The public lecture this evening is really the third of three events that Vistar had organized for the Kappan Centenary year. The first was a seminar, the second was an evening of music, and now the public lecture. We are delighted that so many of you have made time to be here. Several of you have been at earlier lectures, and some of you are here for the first time. A very warm welcome to each one of you. The annual lecture is organized in celebration of the life and work of Dr. Sebastian Kappan, S.J., philosopher, author, and liberation theologian who has inspired and mentored many dissenters and dreamers in India. Kappan did his doctoral studies from the Gregorian University, Rome, with a thesis on praxis and religious alienation according to the economic and philosophical manuscripts of Karl Marx. His subsequent studies have been geared to the requirements of a transformative social action. This led him to an investigation into the liberative and humanizing potential of the original teachings of the historical Jesus, as well as Indian religious traditions, particularly the tradition of dissent represented by Buddha and medieval Bhakti. He saw the process of social transformation as a transition from inherited cultural bondages to freedom for fashioning a new humane and humanizing culture. He believed that a new social order could be brought about only by protesting against oppressive systems, by daring to dissent and ushering in a counterculture. The subversive creative praxis takes concrete form in political as well as cultural action aimed at challenging the cultural hegemony of the ruling classes and restoring to the common people the right to think their own thoughts and frame their own scale of values. Sebastian Kappan. Reflecting on the state of the country after the Babri Masjid demolition in 1992, Kappan wrote, "The myth of the Hindu Rashtra can be met only by an alternative project that combines myth and reason, the sacred and the secular. In this perspective, nationality will have to be defined not only in terms of citizens organized under various secular institutions, but also as a union of communities, each community maintaining its own identity, without, however, any one community enjoying hegemony over the rest." Kappan envisioned a culture that celebrates the mystery and the sacredness of life. A socialist by conviction, Kappan carried his beliefs into his writings and talks. His writings have not been without impact on social thinking in the country. His bold and original path of rethinking, his breaking of conceptual taboos, and his rejection of inherited schemata make him an indispensable guide for those of us who are struggling to grasp and articulate a theory and praxis of a counterculture. Kappan has authored over 30 books, both in Malayalam and in English. Earlier speakers at this Karpan Memorial Lecture include the lecture this evening will be delivered by Professor Yogendra Yadav, and it will be moderated by Kirtana Kumar, an accomplished actor, director, filmmaker based in Bengaluru. Friends, would you please put your hands together and welcome Kirtana Kumar.
Good evening, friends. Good evening, fellow travelers. My daughter asked me why I say fellow travelers, and I felt we all are that, aren't we? All of us just taking step after step together. I wonder if you are as intrigued as I am by the title, Re-Enchanting Democracy. It sounds feminine to me, or at least the domain of enchantment sounds feminine. We've heard of enchantresses, never heard of an enchanter. The etymology of the word comes from the Latin incantare, meaning singing, or cantare means singing, so singing upon. Somehow with this enchantment, we lure people in. So re-enchantment, the word re-enchantment, alongside the very parched and dry sounds of democracy and republic, evokes possibility, allure, excitement, participation, and magic. Obviously, time today is of the essence, so let me be brief and allow the lecture and the conversation with all of you that will follow to take maximum space. In lieu of an introduction today, I ask that you frame Professor Yogendra Yadav not through his accomplishments and resume, not through all the information you can quite easily find on Google, but rather through his thoughts and ideas, and I will point you towards two of them. One is to do with his essays on Dr. Raman. I also wish to say that both the two that I picked out of the many thoughts and ideas had personal relevance to me, so therefore I chose these two. One is to do with his essays on Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia. And the reason it's personal is because my husband is named Konarak Manohar after Ram Manohar Lohia. In them, you may find the dots that join Sebastian Karpan's liberation theology, Indian grassroots movements, civil society power and vision, the difficult question of whether secular politics can draw its intellectual resources from indigenous spiritual traditions, and finally, yes, enchantment. Professor Yogendra Yadav mentions how Lohia's Saptakranti, or 7 revolutions, that all of you are very familiar with, have faded away from public memory, an erasure that has been supported by both the left and the right. Why? Why, one wonders? Well, here is what Professor Yadav writes in another context. Truth is a refugee in our times. Exiled from its home under the sun, it seeks shelter. We shun it in polite drawing room conversations and in WhatsApp groups, too embarrassed by this distant relative from our village. It keeps away from TV studios for fear of being lynched. Like a beggar on the street, it is invisible, too familiar to make it to the front pages, too old to be worthy of news. But simple truths seem to lift their heads like wildflowers among the grassroots. Containing as they do the pillars of constitutionality, the Saptakranti have been reignited by people's movements and CSOs in the last decades simply because they are simple, accessible, and speak truth to power. Everything that once again this group has talked about and worked on for decades: gender equality, resistance to political, economic, race-based inequalities, the destruction of caste, the stand against colonialism, the support to economic equality, planned production, the stand against private property, the interference, jurisprudence interference in private life, the stand against arms and weapons, and of course, satyagraha. The other idea is connected to our mutual friend, Ashish Kothari and Vikalp Sangam. Professor Yadav observes the absurdity of so-called modern development in the Banni grasslands of Kutch and asks that for a moment we disrupt the idea of modernity as being something of urban discovery alone. He speaks of how various governments have propagated this. It's ridiculous if I say it to you, but there's a weed called Prosopis juliflora or Netluma juliflora, botanists among you will know, my daughter, And it's a woody shrub imported from Mexico, which has completely colonized the grasslands, making them inhospitable to the mal, or the cattle, and the maldhari, the human local inhabitants. What then is modernity? How then do we care for the needs of all? That ends my introduction. Finally, and just to stir things up, let me throw in two final words in connection with Professor Yogendra Yadav, with absolutely no explanation at all. The words are mangoes and cricket. Thank you so much. And I welcome Professor Yogendra Yadav.
I should begin by thanking Bistara for this great honor. And I say so because when David read out the list of speakers in this series, you can clearly see I don't fit there. It's such a distinguished list of speakers, many of who are people I've drawn inspiration from, learned from. And it is indeed an honor to join that queue at some point. It's truly humbling. Also, thanks for introducing me to Father Kapin. I'm ashamed to say that while I had heard his name and I had flipped through that book on socialism, because that used to be my early research interest, Future of Indian Socialism. So that's how I connected with him. But I didn't quite read him. And now that I've got to read him briefly and what I've heard in the seminar, I feel very bad that I did not read him earlier because, and I don't say it simply because I happen to be delivering this lecture, because my quest for quite some time has been that there are two parallel intellectual streams in 20th century India. One is that of the tradition of decolonization, very indigenous and rooted. The other is the strong egalitarian streak. And I have felt and have said repeatedly that it is only by bringing these two streams together, by getting these two streams to converse with each other, that we can respond to the challenge of 21st century. And that's what draws me to Ram Manohar Lohia. That is what drew me to Kishan Patnaik, because these are thinkers who were trying to bring these two traditions together, egalitarianism and decolonization. And Father Kappan seems to be exactly that kind of person, probably deeper than other sources that I've drawn upon. What you read out after, of what he wrote after 1992 is exactly what this country needs to learn from. And my sense has been, and I've said again and again, it is the spiritual vacuousness of our secular politics which is responsible for where we have landed today. We need that in this country, revolution need not turn its back to religions. Religion actually happens to be the site for revolutions in this country. So I'm really thankful to you for giving me this opportunity to begin my journey to discover Father Kapin. It so happens that the theme that I had originally suggested for this lecture would have absolutely fitted for Intellectual Quest of Father Kapin. I had suggested to Mercy that I speak on what I call India's Swadharma. That's actually, so the passage that you read out, in my language, it translates into search for India's Swadharma. I think later, Mercy may have read one of my articles in the newspaper, and she was quite enchanted by this this idea of democracy's enchantment. No, I don't resent changing the title. I actually am grateful because now whenever I write about India's Swadharma, I would write after having read Father Kapil, which is what it should have been like. So thanks for saving me and for bringing me closer to the theme that we discuss, that we must discuss today. Because democracy is the reigning deity of our times. The thing about reigning deities is this, that you cannot but worship them, that you keep having questions, but you cannot allow yourself those questions because you are up against a reigning deity. This is our trouble with democracy. We fight battles, but we fight that battles. We must fight that in the name of democracy. Democracy is something whose absence we bemoan. We bemoan it quite a lot and with very good reasons for the last 10 years. What I'm going to argue is something slightly different. I would present my argument in 3 parts. I will begin by arguing that the crisis of democracy that we have today is deeper than it appears. It's not merely a crisis of non-fulfillment of democratic procedures in practice. The crisis is that of the very conception of democracy. It is not merely an Indian crisis. We are looking at a global crisis. That's part 1. In part 2, I would suggest that this crisis has deep roots, deep conceptual roots. It's not an accident. It's not because of something that happened in the last 20, 30, 40 years. That there has been a certain tension, a contradiction, which is at the heart of democratic enterprise. In part 3, I would say how we should not respond to this crisis and how we should respond. That's where enchantment comes. I would argue that we should not exercise the option of breaking the spell of democracy and just keep the distance from it. That we must find ways of re-enchanting it. All right, part 1. Much of our conversation in today's India is about how undemocratic the current regime is. I don't need to go over this with this kind of audience. We all know it. We talk about it every day. We talk about the undeclared emergency. We talk about violations of human rights. We talk about suppression of minorities. We talk about breakdown of minimal protocols of parliament. We talk about lack of free and fair elections. But that's not merely an Indian situation. And that's not merely a problem with the practice of democracy. The fact is that the real life of democracy is a far cry from the romantic story of democracy that has been told to us by the dominant orthodoxy. What is that lovely story of democracy? The lovely story of democracy that is taught to us in textbooks. I must confess that I'm guilty of writing some of those textbooks, which if you read class 9, 10 textbooks of NCERT, you would understand why I have these pangs of guilt. The dominant orthodoxy presented us with a neat definition of democracy, which is a normative standard, which allowed every political regime to be pigeonholed into democracy or non-democracy binary. It supplied us with an institutional checklist which can be used across the globe to operationalize the idea of democracy. It wove a lovely tale of nations' utopian transition to, consolidation of, and culmination in a finished product called democracy. This is the lovely telos. The whole world is marching towards democracy. At the Top of it, we know who stands at the top, the US of A. Now, this is the highly stylized and selective version of what has in fact been contingent path that democracy has taken in a tiny but dominant part of the globe. This is a global story that everyone has noticed. Everyone has noticed that something has gone wrong with this global story. And all of us must be deeply grateful to Donald Trump and to the United States of America for bringing the truth to everyone's light. We needn't have waited for Donald Trump's return to power to ask this question. Somehow, when the landlord in the village catches a disease, everyone notices the pandemic. Till the landlord catches that disease, no one notices it. We could have asked this question after his first victory in 2016, or after Modi ji's triumph in 2019, or perhaps after his popular endorsement following 2002 pogroms in Gujarat. After all, that was a popular endorsement through democratic mechanisms. Or if we care to look at the rest of the world, after Viktor Orban's rise to power in Hungary in 2010, Benjamin Netanyahu's vice-like grip in post-2009 Israel, Rajapaksa's family control in Sri Lanka after 2004, beginning of Erdogan's regime in Turkey in 2003, Thaksin's victory in Thailand in 2001, and so on and so on. The harsh truth is that the record of actually existing democracies in delivering good outcomes is actually not so good. The phenomena of democratically elected and re-elected leaders unleashing political bad, chaos, corruption, criminality, ethnicide, ecological destruction, and what have you, while retaining their popularity, is not something new. If we care to look without blinkers and beyond affluent European societies, it is hard to resist the conclusion that what we assume to be the benefits of a normal, functional democracy are largely fictional. Success stories of democracy are usually happy coincidences that last for a limited period. These episodes are bright stars in a dark sky of shades of democratic disappointments, failures, and disasters. These are very harsh things to say. But I think our times require us to recognize that democratic governments do not improve our chances of good governance, rule of law, or well-being of its citizens. Not to speak of climate change, issues concerning future generations, or non-human creatures and nature. उसकी तो बात ही छोड़ दीजिए आप. This is the record of actually existing democracies. Now, lest some of us begin wondering, what is this man up to? What exactly is he saying? Is he building a case for authoritarianism? No, I'm not. Because three things still continue to work for democracy. One, that democratic governments fare no worse in this respect than authoritarian governments. That much we can say, honestly. Two, a democracy enhances the chances of decisions leading to bad outcomes being detected or corrected. That's the famous Amartya Sen thesis. It just increases the probability that someone will catch these things a little ahead of time. And three, a democracy enhances a citizen's self-worth, irrespective of whether they get what they want. These arguments are good enough to reject authoritarian alternatives. But these hardly constitute a ringing endorsement of the ideological deity of modern world. The fact is that some of the disasters that we have seen in recent times have not been disasters of the upstaging of democracy or of violation of democracy. In fact, many of these have happened through the mechanism of democracy. And that's the 21st century style. I mean, I keep saying in 21st century, everything is smart. Children are smart, phones are smart, authoritarian leaders are also smart. Everything is done in the name of democracy and by using the mechanism of democracy. The long list that I read out, except in one or two cases, you cannot say that the elections that they won were unfair elections. It's through, in and through duly constituted majority rule. You cannot say that Mr. Trump has won an unfair election. And that is something we avoid facing this because it hurts us, because it pains us. This sober record, however, has not affected celebrations of the dominant model of democracy and attempts to export it all over the world. The dominant theory of democracy kept up the fiction that instances of democratic failure were exceptions, the dark underbelly of democracy, to an otherwise benign global tide of democratization. The charm of democracy has led everyone to believe that such populist leaders acquired and retained power despite democracy, not because of democracy. An attachment to democracy meant a celebration of wafer-thin spread of democratic rituals all over the world. The trouble is that, like market failures, these democratic failures are not aberrations or malfunctioning of democratic apparatus. These possibilities are built into the political system that we call democracy. Now, that's the harsh thing to accept. You cannot brush it away as minor exceptions, minor misuse of the system. This possibility is built into, I saw that in Gujarat in 2002. I traveled for a few weeks in Gujarat after the 2002 riots. And I went there expecting popular angst, popular anger. And what I witnessed there just changed me completely. My wife called me and said, so what are so generally interested in what are you seeing in Gujarat? I said, these are shades of black that I see. And you cannot say that what happened thereafter in Gujarat election was manipulation or not popular verdict. This was genuine popular verdict, endorsing a genuine massacre. Now, so part two is, what is the root of the crisis? The root of the crisis is that what we call democracy is actually two things rolled into one. I said this morning to my friends that, you see, it's like offering prayer. You remember God, you start praying, you close your eyes, and that God is replaced by a statue. The statue is replaced by a priest of whatever religion, doesn't matter, all of them are the similar kinds. And when you open your eyes, you ask yourself, is this fellow that I've been praying for? Is this person that I'm worshipping? Something similar has happened to us in worshipping democracy. There are two very different things, both of which are called democracy. One is the idea and ideal. Democracy is one of the most commonly used positive word, at least in the last century or so. Democracy is an ideal that you can hardly quarrel with. What it promises us, this word with amazingly universal provenance, perhaps the most potent term for claiming political authority in global political speech today. It is a charming political ideal that outcompetes any foreseeable rival, a vision of a society where all citizens have equal effective control over all significant collective decisions. What a lovely ideal. How can you quarrel with it? How can you not worship it? The trouble is that the same word democracy is also used for a mechanism. So we are told, as we are also told while we worship, that God is somewhere, but right now what you have is a temple in front of you, a mosque or a church. So that abstract ideal translates itself into something real. We are also told that democracy is the name of a regime and a political mechanism. What is that mechanism? All of us have universally started believing that the mechanism of representative government through periodic elections that are decided by some form of majority rule. We are told this is democracy. So democracy is an ideal. Democracy is also the name for a mechanism. The moral charm is exercised by the ideal. And the entire moral charm and authority of that ideal is then transferred onto this mechanism, which is a very contingent mechanism. There's nothing very sacrosanct about this mechanism. There is something seemingly okay with it, but if you see its practice in reality, this is a very fragile mechanism, open to all forms of abuse, which are written into this mechanism. I'll just come to that. And the trouble is that we begin to then worship the mechanism, and because we worship the mechanism, we have to worship the outcome of the mechanism as well. Trump, Modi, Orban, everyone, because they are legitimate products of that mechanism. So how do we define the mechanism? The definition of the mechanism is that democracy is a form of government in which those who rule are elected by the people in competitive elections and run the risk of losing power in regular elections. This is how political science has defined it. Adam Shawarsky and others, very careful and nuanced definition these are. So they say, forget the ideal. In reality, how do you recognize a democratic regime? A democratic regime, therefore, is a regime where, number one, there should be regular elections. The elections should be competitive in the sense that there should be more than one serious contender. The opposition should have a fair chance of winning should they have popular support. The electoral mechanism cannot be revoked by the loser, and the winner should get to exercise highest political power, and elections should be held at regular intervals, irrespective of the wishes of the incumbent. These are the 3 or 4 simple conditions which have been prescribed as a mechanism to recognize what is legitimate democracy. The trouble, of course, is that most of the instances that I've mentioned to you pass all these tests. They are actually proper, true democracy in every one of these respects. Why does that happen so? I think it happens because the underlying logic of political democracy is not very dissimilar to the underlying logic of market. The assumption behind this mechanism is the following. Just as in the theory of open market, we know the problems with open market, but the theory of open market tells you that consumer has a need, the need translates into demand. When there's demand, someone comes to supply it. They have more than one shops to choose from. Whoever supplies them the best stuff, that shop does well. They have better incentives. Therefore, consumer gets what they want, and the best shop wins. That's the theory of open market. This is the theory of democratic governance too, underlying theory. So the theory tells us, and so you can see the problem. There are 5 or 6 unstated assumptions here. The first is that if people have a need, that need will be translated into demand. That people have beliefs and attitude and values of a certain kind, that if there is a problem, I know that there is a problem and I would articulate it. Now just think of Delhi. In that city where I live, everyone is losing a few years of their life because of air pollution. Travel in Delhi city and ask ordinary people, do they think it's a problem? I bet 80% will not say it's a problem. So there goes your first assumption. The idea that need is perceived to be a need and is articulated as demand. Unless you demand something, democracy would never give it to you. Please also think about those who cannot articulate their demands, their needs. Non-human beings obviously cannot. If you are not an adult, you obviously cannot. Future generations not born right now, no say. Not to talk of animals and nature and other things. So that's the first assumption, that every need will be articulated as demand. It's not. It depends on a certain political culture. For someone to begin to articulate that education is a need, health is a need, environment matters, these things don't become political issues by themselves. The second assumption is that these demands will be translated into signals, political signals. Because thousands or millions of people demanding something doesn't become politically relevant unless it is translated into a signal. Who does that signaling? Mass media. Unless mass media reports a demand to be a demand, sitting in Delhi, how do I know that there is a problem in Madhya Pradesh or in Karnataka or anywhere else? So the second assumption is that any demand from the ground will be picked up and converted into headlines, which politicians will watch in the evening when they are drinking tea or something else. Is that a real assumption? Is that a credible assumption? What is the relationship between what becomes news and what is being demanded on the ground? Indian media, it's only fair to say, is of the middle classes, for the middle classes, and by the middle classes. And incidentally, this entity called middle class is in the middle of nowhere. It is a euphemism for Indian ruling class. Ruling classes all over the world like to call themselves by other words. No ruling class ever says, we are the ruling class. They say, we are Bhadralok. We are the civilized ones. In India, they say, we are the middle class. So, that's what Indian media reflects. That's what media, in fact, all over the world does. That's the second assumption. Third assumption is that once these signals arrive, and I'm not saying no signal arrives. Some signals do arrive. Farmers' MSP is being signaled because someone is sitting on a fast. It's more than 35 days. It has made it somehow to the headlines. So the third assumption is once these signals arrive, then there would be more than one political contenders who would receive it and would compete with each other to provide an alternative, just as shops do, just as rediwalas do in the market. You know, you want to take bananas from me, not from that person. My banana is better, you know. The trouble is that creating political party of any kind, and ask me, I have some experience in this business. Creating political parties for the most legitimate reason, with the most dedicated and honest people, is an impossible task. Because the minimum entry barriers, the entry gate to the world of competitive politics is so high that unless you have a few 100 crore rupees that you can access, or you have the privilege of just riding on some movement or some major political development. Otherwise, you can stand outside the gate and keep staring it for as long as you wish to. There is simply no entry. So, creating political party is not like opening a chai shop. It's like, I was saying this to a friend yesterday, it's like someone, it's like saying that, yes, anyone can open a chai shop here. The minimum amount required, you need to invest about 1 crore rupees to open a chai shop. If that were to be the condition, would you have those lovely chai and the wonderful filter coffee that you get in Bengaluru? The lovely idli that you get on street sides. If the minimum investment required for opening an eatery was 10 crore rupees, all of these would disappear overnight. This is the world of politics. The minimum required, and it's not just money, footprint, name recognition, the minimum required to create a party and to be able to offer an alternative is so high that signals come, and signals can be not received, or there can be collusion. You don't raise it, I won't raise it. Finish. You can keep demanding as much as you want to. If the two top parties agree that they don't want to make it an issue, it's not an issue. Or if two parties decide to make a complete non-issue into an issue, that is the biggest issue of the time. As you know, in Delhi right now, the two top parties, Aam Aadmi Party and the Bharatiya Janata Party, are in a fierce contest with each other on who is responsible for bringing Rohingyas to Delhi. This is the competition right now. How many Rohingyas exist in Delhi? Maybe 500, maybe 1,000. But what is the game? The name of the game is to say who is more anti-Muslim than the other. That's the game. So a complete non-issue can become the predominant issue. And the biggest issue is a non-issue. And this is not surprising. Once you see the structure through which these things are processed, it should not surprise us. It should shock us. But there's nothing very surprising about what happens, because this is the process through which it takes. Finally, that once, suppose someone has managed to cross all these three stages. Suppose an issue is recognized, let us say something like an MSP for the farmer, does figure on political agenda. Suppose political parties do take it up, they do compete, and they do. I'm not saying that real issues never come up to the top. Occasionally, one or two real issues do come up to the top. They do become an issue, but occasionally, once in a while. Because the filtration process is such that it's bound to throw out most of the legitimate issues. When they come up, then the fourth issue, which is related to governance, which is, okay, so someone should promise that I will do this. Here is a demand which has been signaled, which has been aggregated. I will do it, unlike this other fellow. All right, I get voted. What is the assumption here? The assumption is there is free and fair election. Not just, these days we have reduced the question of free and fair election to free and fair voting. That's not free and fair election. The minimum required in a free and fair election would be level playing ground. Do we have anything remotely resembling level playing ground? Probably in the US, level because both of them were indulging in enormous money. Both of them had so much money to spend that at least you cannot say Mr. Trump won because of money. on the face of it, Democratic Party actually spent more money than Mr. Trump did. So you can't. But by and large, I mean, if you look at 2024 election in India, the very talk of level playing ground would be a joke. You know, you have the ruling party, which is spending not more than the opposition. It is probably spending 50 times more than the opposition, probably 100 times more than the opposition. In one single parliamentary constituency, I know it, and I know it from sources who should know. So BJP was spending more than 100 crores in one parliamentary constituency. You know, where is level playing ground? So the assumption is that you are competing, both of you are able to call out the customer is able to see both of you, and then can decide which one is offering me better product. But that competition never happens. And the final step of that is that, okay, you somehow have been able to pick up the right need, called, you picked the right issue, you picked the party, you voted, the party won. Does the party actually do what it said it will do? Or does it simply say, हाँ जुमले थे, बोले थे, it's all right. जुमला तो बोलना ही पड़ता है election में. The mechanism of democracy functions on the assumption that the voters will be able to punish those who do not perform. If someone lies to me, I can punish that person. If you can't, then where is the question of that mechanism working? So all I'm trying to say is the problem with democracy is this, that there is this lovely ideal, very powerful ideal, an ideal that we must not give up, which is translated into a mechanism and a relationship of equivalence is established. If you love democracy, you must love this mechanism called democracy. And you must accept every outcome of this mechanism because you love democracy. This is what is leading, and because this mechanism, in the best of time, has all these assumptions, unstated assumptions. Yes, democracy works provided there is a political culture in which people can translate their needs into demands. If there is a media which would convert these demands into powerful signals, if there is possibility of people being able to create political parties which would respond to these signals in case someone else is not responding, and there is level playing ground so that different competitors can actually sell their promises in a fair way. And finally, there is a punishment mechanism for non-performers. If all this exists, then this mechanism probably leads you towards the ideal that you were worshipping. If these things do not exist, this mechanism can produce exactly the opposite of what you were worshipping. This is our problem with democracy. Now, what then is the way out? One way would be to say, okay, now that we know, so in a sense, all I'm saying is that we face a gigantic sleight of hand, a conceptual trick that has created an equivalence of these different meanings of democracy, the ideal and the mechanism. The moral charm of the ideal of democracy is used to reinforce the potency of the word democracy, and their combined power is deployed to justify the rulers who manage to tick enough boxes in the institutional checklist of democracy. These two things are bundled so tightly that any questioning of democracy as a form of government is presumed to be an attack on the very ideal of democracy. This leads to a hypnotic smell of democracy that can be a moral cloak to cover dubious and dangerous regimes and make us unsee the stark reality that stares us in our face. This is what's happening all over the world. How do we respond to this? One option is breaking the spell of democracy. I borrow this expression from a theorist and historian of democracy called John Donne, who's been writing very systematically on this issue. And I must say, he wrote all this before Mr. Donald Trump arrived, before Mr. Modi's first victory. He has been writing consistently to question the dominant global orthodoxy on democracy, and not from a Marxist perspective, not saying it's a bourgeois democracy or something of that kind, but simply unpacking and saying, what are you doing? Do you know what you are endorsing? John Donne says that what we need to do is to break the spell of democracy, detach the regimes from lofty ideals of democracy, and then treat democracy just as one more form of government that carries no special claim to moral authority. That's his proposal. That, he says, but when exactly did people start saying that democracy was something lovely? He says it's a very recent thing. Why are you being tricked? No Greek would have made this mistake of assuming that democracy was going to give you good governance. Most people, this is just one of the forms of government. Stop worshipping it. The trouble with this suggestion, intellectually powerful as it is, there are twofold trouble. One is that this word has already gained so much moral currency that you cannot evacuate it now. Words have certain power, certain charm. Over the years, they gather dust, they also gather diamonds and gold. They carry it with them. And if they carry it, you can't then pluck it out. Democracy is a word which has by now acquired so much charm and power that the idea that you now disabuse people of this notion is, even if it was a good idea, it is an impossible proposition. The second problem, of course, is what's the alternative? Are we proposing something better? Are we proposing something different? Probably not. So, hence my proposal that instead of taking the more academic and intellectual route, I would suggest a radically different option, which would be to re-enchant democracy. This would mean taking the high ideals of democracy seriously and examining each actually existing society that claims to be democracy against those powerful ideals. That would involve a willingness to acknowledge that so-called democratic regimes do not offer to their citizen anything that remotely resembles equal power to shape politics, policy, or personal outcomes that matter to people. It required a willingness to say that we don't have any finished product democracy, any real model of democracy, that what we have are at best potential democracies, that democracy is a work in progress. So my suggestion is exactly the opposite, which is to say, keep the charm of the word, but turn that ideal into a critique of the mechanism. Any mechanism that claims itself to be democratic must show me that it actually gives people equal power to control any significant decision concerning their life. If it doesn't, you are a pretend democracy, you are not a real democracy. Which democratic ideal should we re-enchant? The dominant global understanding has been something that we have called liberal democracy. I don't want to get into serious history of idea dispute. There are friends who know it much better than I do. I would suggest that actually there is a much deeper and much more radical ideal of democracy available to us, which should be called republican democracy. Our constitution calls ourselves not just a democracy, it says we are a democratic republic. The word republic has intrigued me because when I was in school, in class 9, my civics teacher told me that, well, republic is a form of government in which there is no king, in which the person who rules the country is not hereditary. That's all. That's what I continue to believe in my understanding of political science. Now that I look back, I think the word republic has much deeper meaning, much deeper resonance, something that we missed. Republic presumes a political community. A political community must have some bonds, must have some shared ideals. And those ideals must be kept alive. Otherwise, that community doesn't exist. Republic reminds us of the existence of a public. And republicanism, incidentally, you see, we don't sufficiently pay attention to two things in our intellectual history. One is the European intellectual history, the other is Indian intellectual history. Republicanism is a much deeper, stronger current of thought than liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is much more recent. Republicanism goes much deeper, the ideal of civic republicanism that goes to 500 years ago to Italy. Republicanism, instead of anchoring itself in the liberal ideal of non-interference, republicanism grounds itself in the ideal of non-dominance. Now that's a more radical way of interpreting democracy. Also, republicanism enables us to connect with the ancient Indian republics, the ideal of Ganatantra. And incidentally, it's not me who's trying to establish that connection. Baba Sahib Ambedkar actually spoke about it because of his interest in the shamanic tradition, his interest in Buddhism. So my proposal is that we should reinvest this word democracy with deeper and more radical connotations than has been passed on to us, and use it then as a critique of all the existing mechanisms and forms of government, whether they measure up to or they do not. What are the implications of what I am suggesting? I'll quickly talk about three kinds of implications and then stop. One is purely theoretical for friends who are interested in democratic theory. Normally, public lectures should not get into this, but since this is in the memory of Father Kapin, who understood the power of theory and power of theory to distort our view of what we have in front of our eyes. Because the trouble with theory is this, that a theory can make us see things that no one else can see. And theory can make us unsee things which are right in front of our eyes. That's the problem with theories. And that's the beauty of theories. So, the theoretical proposals are, first of all, the proposals are about rethinking the dominant democratic theory. First of all, we need to widen the conceptual apparatus of democracy to include diverse ways, languages, idioms, theories, in which democracy has been understood all over the world. Democracy is not merely property of Western political thought, not merely the property of a tiny part of the world. In multiple ways, people have thought about it. In fact, Buddha has this lovely expression when someone speaks to him about, should we invade this country? Buddha gives a response to say, he doesn't say don't invade. He says, and that's a republic which is to be invaded. And Buddha says, go and find out, do these people consult each other before they take a decision? Do they do this? Do they do this? Do they do this? If they do it, don't attack that country. That already is a deep notion of republic, of republican, a democratic republic, which is built there. So we need to look at, and this is something you would find in Africa, you would find in Latin America, all parts of the world. Second, it requires enriching the normative standards embedded in the idea of democracy by taking into account the many histories and traditions of democratic thinking across the world, something I've just referred to. Third, we need to expand the repertoire of institutions, conventions, and practices that go into the making of democracy in societies that are often quite different from each other. You know, the trouble is that we are being told that unless we have been handed over a checklist, go to Afghanistan, bring democracy to Afghanistan, and the way to bring democracy is to create a parliament. The parliament should be elected in this way. It should have the following constitution and so on. And once you've done it, great, you've established democracy. And that's how we established democracy in Iraq, didn't we? Iraq, Afghanistan, we forced them to be free, one after another. Could it be that democratic institutions could take very, very different forms in different kinds of societies? I noticed that the lecture given by Vandana Shiva in this series earlier was about different forms of democracy, ecological democracy, of course. So that's something to be thought about. And we need to rewrite the history of actually existing democracies, both in global north and global south, to reflect their radically different experiences and trajectories. So one part of re-enchanting democracy is about rewriting democratic theory. Second part is about radically rethinking the mechanisms. Partha Chatterjee has recently written something, and his basic argument is that we have allowed the logic of state to trump over the logic of the nation. This is what has happened in the last 75 years. And we need to find ways of bringing the logic of the nation, what he called people nation, to once again overcome the logic of state. In that spirit, we need to rethink the mechanisms in our context that actually meet the what should then qualify to be democracy. Minimally, that should include radical decentralization. I mean, even before decentralization, at least federalism, which we are beginning to lose what we had for the last 70 years. So just a bare recognition that India cannot be governed from Delhi. And there's one nation, one election, one nation, one something, something. All these are ways of bypassing the federal spirit of our constitution. So retaining and preserving our federal legacy, although the word federalism has not been used in our constitution for some reason. Second is radical decentralization. No matter how great the ruler, no matter how beautiful the method through which they have been elected, someone sitting in Delhi cannot understand what's happening in Uttar Kannada. So and the same applies to someone sitting in Bengaluru either. You really cannot. A radical decentralization of power, constitutional constraints on majoritarianism. We need to actually strengthen the existing constitutional constraints, because constitutions are about constraining governments. This basic argument somehow has disappeared from our public vocabulary today. Constitutions are not about enabling government. Constitutions are about disabling governments. Constitutions are about saying, no matter what your majority, no matter this, you cannot touch this. And all those things are being diluted today. So actually strengthening of constitutional mechanism, because the question of majoritarianism, the tendency of majoritarianism is built into this mechanism itself. Unless you provide for constitutional no-go zones, this is bound to happen. Also, something that we don't have in our constitution is some constitutional limits to what one generation can do to resources of another generation. Unfortunately, we have no constitution. South African constitution begins to do that. But otherwise, most constitutions just don't have it. So in my state, Haryana, my generation has basically drank all the waters for the next 7 generations. That's actually what has happened. There is no water. In my village, the water is 500 feet below, although the water is brackish. They've gone 500 feet below, in some places 1,000 feet below. So basically what you've done is that you've drank the quota for the next 7 generations because they do not yet have vote. It's only constitution that can, constitutions are meant precisely to do this. For future generations, for non-humans, and for nature. Unless you have those constraints, this mechanism of majority-based democracy can never provide you constraints of that kind. And level playing ground on 2 most critical issues. Somehow political reforms is the hobby horse of this country, and everyone has their pet theory on how this country can be transformed. And all of us have started following Mr. Modi in one respect, that we all first look at the medicine and then we search for the disease, which is relevant for that particular medicine. I mean, this has become a national obsession now. This is exactly what demonetization was. I love this medicine. Now let me think of what disease can this medicine solve. Ye nahi to dusra, dusra nahi to tisra, kuch to karega. This is one nation, one election. Exactly this. I think we need to think the other way around. What are the real serious issues in our elections? And I think the 2 biggest issues in our elections currently are unequal access to money and unequal access to information. Media, money. These are the 2 biggest constraints in our elections currently, although people love to discuss all other things. Unless there is some semblance of parity that can be established, elections will simply not reflect popular will. There is no way. They are designed not to reflect popular will. So these mechanisms need to be thought of. But I don't want to end the lecture just with this. To my mind, it's not merely about changing constitutions. Re-enchanting democracy is not merely about redesigning institutions, changing democratic theory, rewriting some bits of our constitution. In the last instance, re-enchanting democracy is about practice, about what we do. No constitution in the world can give you good government unless you work at it every single day. It's a brute reality. And our generation, I speak of my generation, I think we are seriously guilty of a criminal default. We inherited a certain constitution, we inherited certain institutions, we just assumed that they would do their job, democracy would continue to produce reasonably decent outcomes, and we all devoted ourselves to our personal pursuits. Only to realize that constitutional values do not reproduce themselves. Someone has to reproduce it for new generation in a new lingo, in a new metaphor, in a new language, every 25 years or so. Constitutional values need to be re-articulated, re-enchanted. The way this word came to me was mainly through this idea that these words need to be given new life. Merely by saying this is constitution, this is what Baba Sahib Ambedkar got it, they don't mean a thing to the new generation. It is by articulating it in their language or by connecting it to day-to-day struggles and concerns of ordinary people who live their life on the margins of this country. That is how you can re-enchant democracy. 2 specific things. Democracies all over the world are protected not in parliaments. In the last instance, democracies are defended by the public on the street. That all over the world, not just in India. One should never expect legislatures or judiciary, forget executive. Executive is also the problem. But judiciary is not, more often than not, judiciary is not part of the solution. It's part of the problem. And media certainly is part of the problem. In the last instance, republics are defended by the public out on the street. So, the practice that I was talking about involves strengthening social movements. In our democracy, institutions have always been very fragile. This has been one of the designing problems of Indian democracy. Our institutions have always been fragile. But our movements have covered up for the weakness of our institutions. And those movements need to be strengthened. Strengthening of movement is one practice. And creating a new language, a language that draws upon things that people genuinely value. That's what connects me again to Father Kapil. And I was really intrigued by the quote that you read out. You know, while all of us, most of us sitting in this room, would deeply regret what's happening in the country today, would deeply be appalled by what the rulers of this country are up to, what we are unwilling to recognize is that we have handed over to them some of the deepest assets of this country, of this civilization. 3 I would mention and stop. Nationalism, civilizational pride, cultural pride, and religion. These 3 things were our civilizational heritage. These were our weapons. These are things national movement drew upon. Gradually, the liberal progressive elite of this country started becoming embarrassed about nationalism. What we did was we vicariously started inheriting the embarrassment of European elite about European nationalism. And they have very good reasons to be embarrassed about their nationalism. But we don't. You know, why should I feel embarrassed about nationalism in the way in which Germans feel embarrassed about German nationalism? I have a positive nationalism to inherit. My nationalism connected me to South Africa, to Palestinians, it took me to Bandung. My nationalism never pitted me against my neighbor. Why should I hand over this legacy of nationalism to those who did not give 1 ounce of blood for this country's freedom? This is a criminal neglect on our part. 2, civilizational pride. Every civilization in the world, every community in this world likes to feel good about itself. And every community has reasons to feel good about themselves, which is not to say that your past did not contain evil and problems. What our national movement did was that it picked up the best from our past and it applied a filter to discard what was not acceptable in our past. What our liberal, educated, modern elite did was that they simply turned their back to our past, unlike our national movement. This is true in terms of language, the language that we speak. I mean, our liberal elite has almost no connect to the people of this country. If you cannot share someone's sense of cultural well-being, pride, then there's no way you can speak to that person. You cannot say to that person, why are you destroying this mosque? You would say, Acha, tum aaj mujhe batane aaye ho. You know, because we have no connect to them. And finally, religion. And I'm really honored to speak in the memory of Father Kapil here. Because I do believe, unlike what our modern secular elite believed, that religions of this country have been our strength. Religions have carried and have justified a lot of oppression, as all religions do. It's like a river. A river brings you water. A river also brings you sand. It also brings you a lot of trash. You don't stop drinking water because the river actually also brought trash. You separate the trash, you let the sand settle, and then you drink the water. This is what we should have been doing to religion. We have been very serious, criminally negligent of our religious traditions. And in this house, I'm sure no one would misunderstand me. I'm speaking about traditions. We have Christianity in this country did not come with colonialism. But I bet 90% of non-Christian Indians do not know this. Everyone associates Christianity with colonialism. You know, my Christianity is older than Europe's Christianity. Why can't I draw from that? Islam came to my country as soon as it came to the rest of the world. Why should I take my lessons of Islam from some Arab country? There are deep traditions in all the religions of this country. Our national movement leaders were conscious of the fact that they needed to keep that connect. In post-independence India, we lost that connect. And as soon as we lost that connect, we lost our ability to speak to ordinary people. So, re-enchanting democracy would be about recovering that language. That cannot be an instrumental thing. You cannot run down religion all your life and then write a pamphlet on Vivekananda and say how great Vivekananda was. It doesn't work, doesn't wash. No one believes you, no one takes you seriously. You know, we have to imbibe these things. We have to genuinely begin to respect this. All these are awkward ideas. I'm sure some of my friends may be upset about my saying these things. But we live in times when we should not bother about making our friends happy. We should bother about speaking the truth, which is like a refugee these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was really masterful, the way you took us through the entire lecture. I don't know whether I should begin with being devil's advocate and asking the awkward questions, or should I begin with... maybe what I'll say is that what I really appreciated was this demolition of the idea of democracy, not the ideal of democracy, but the mechanism of democracy. And that's something I'll really take away from this. I'm sure there are others in the audience who will wish to respond to it. Let me just be devil's advocate and talk about the filters, since that's the last thing you did talk about, one of the last things. And I want to say that among the filters that were applied at the time of nationalism and the national movement, some of the filters also had to do with women and promoting a Victorian ideal of womanhood. The other had to do with language. This is a contentious one, and I do want to provoke it further because Lohia too has spoken about the single language, multi-language issue, and I know that largely the language issue, I've spoken to Theodore about this at length, is one that we feel must be reclaimed in order to strengthen ourselves. I'm playing devil's advocate, and I'm saying that in a family such as mine, where we broke with caste and community and language for 3 generations, what happens to our language? And English has given me the power to now speak and to be here at this podium. So what happens to pariahs such as us who speak this colonizer's language? And the third thing has to do with, I've had the longest battle with secular politics because I feel it's been stripped of spirituality or religion and hasn't been able to speak an enchanting language to the people. So I really appreciate that thought. But we can't throw caste out of that. So if you would just respond to those 3, the question of women, the question of caste, and the question of language.
You're not being devil's advocate. Actually, these are the most legitimate questions that such a argument must confront. Now, I look at our national movement. I keep saying Indian Constitution was not framed in 2 years. It was framed in 100 years. It's 100 years of engagement with our past looking at our future. And India's freedom struggle had crafted what I called a very desi modernity. It's very modern. Incidentally, Gandhi also is a very, very modern person in everything that he does. But it's very rooted. Modernity need not copy. Our modernity need not be a poor copy of European modernity. It's something about which our national movement was very conscious. The trouble is that with the coming of political independence, our cultural slavery became deeper than before. Till 1947, we were aware of the fact that we were colonized, we were subjects. The coming of political freedom gave me this false belief that culturally I am no longer a subject, while indeed in reality we continue to be so. The national movement used 2 or 3 filters. The 2 biggest filters used by national movement, filters in the sense of we will receive things from our past, but these following things will straight away put in the dustbin. One was caste. And there has been a consensus. To be fair, even among the right-wing thinkers, there was a consensus about putting caste in the dustbin, if you forget some of their particularly lunatic expressions. But there has been a complete consensus about it may not have been articulated in the language in which Baba Saheb articulated it, but that caste system inequalities must go was part of our national movement consensus.
Lala Lajpat Rai, for example.
Yeah. Even sort of people who are seen as right-wing, as Lala Lajpat Rai, you get that in them. In no constitution of the world would you have something like prohibition of untouchability written in the constitution. It's not a law, it's written in the constitution. So that was one. Second is on the gender question. I would have liked it to be stronger than it is, but there is a clear filter, no discrimination based on gender. Those are things which are written into our constitution. And I'm so very happy that the constitution did that. The language question, I think, has been very poorly understood. Lohiya's own position has been poorly understood, but that doesn't matter. We shouldn't spend time on those things. The consensus of the national movement was not about Hindi. It's a very poor articulation of the consensus of the national movement was about Indian languages to be prioritized. And most of our leaders of freedom struggle, almost all of them, with the exception of Nehru, I think, and partial exception of Baba Saheb Ambedkar, all of them understood and read English. All of them principally wrote and spoke in one of the Indian languages. That to me was the national movement consensus. The difficult question was, how do you translate that into the business of official languages? On which there was some contention in the Constituent Assembly. But once again, the consensus was, the 2 parts to this consensus. The stronger one was about privileging Indian languages. Somehow this question of which one of the Indian languages should get primacy became an issue of dispute in Constituent Assembly. If I were to look at it today, I would say, why do I need to ask this question? We really don't, this business of one official language is a question that got more attention than it deserved, created more controversy, and has been therefore an instrumental for continuing the hegemony of the English language. My problem with English is exactly what Ram Manohar Lohia said. Ram Manohar Lohia said, my problem with English is not that it is a foreign language. My problem is that it's a feudal language, that it's a language of inequality in this country. That's my only issue. After 75 years, I think English is one of the Indian languages. especially if we are willing to if we stop mocking at I am having two cows wali English jo hai. That is our Indian English. It's spoken, it's written. You know, the only reason, you see, don't forget that Australian English and American English was mocked at till the early 20th century. Till the middle of the 20th century, before Marshall Plan, no one thought Americans knew how to speak English. Marshall Plan transformed it. Dollars came, power equations changed. Suddenly, American English became one variant of one acceptable, respectable variant of English. When would our elite start accepting Indian English as a respectable, legitimate variant of English? I'm having two cows is a perfect English. It's only an issue of power. It's only an issue of money. You know, so someone said about dialect and language, what is the difference between a dialect and language? And someone said, a dialect that has an army and a state is a language. And
Lovely.
I think that's the issue. So Indian English is an Indian English. It's one of my languages. I'm perfectly fine with it. On Hindi, I think we need to think of that question carefully. I have repeatedly, incidentally said, the Hindi day should be abolished. It's been not a position I'm taking here in Bengaluru. I've written articles again and again to say Hindi day should be abolished. It should be converted into Indian Languages Day. Hindi is one of the youngest languages in this country. And the metaphor that I have always used is that there are so many sisters. Hindi happens to be the youngest sister. Sometimes young sister happens to have more money than others. You know, in this case, this young sister has bigger footprint. And that bigger footprint is a result of many dialects being merged into Hindi.
And the loss of multiple dialects.
Yeah, exactly. So in a sense, today what we call Hindi-speaking area, if you take someone from Bhagalpur in Bihar and bring that person to my village, I can tell you they would not understand one word of what they are saying, but they would still be called Hindi speakers. So it's through that fudging that it has happened. Hindi can perform a very valuable function. But please remember that one of the most powerful proponents of Hindi were those who were not Hindi speakers. Gandhiji, Bhagat Singh, Baba Sahib. Hindi is useful as long as Hindi is not promoted by the state. Hindi is useful as long as you allow cricket and cinema to do its job. These are the best ambassadors for Hindi. And as long as Hindi allows itself to be expressed in 25 forms, the Hindi spoken in Hyderabad is a perfect Hindustani. The Hindi being spoken on the streets in Bengaluru in Shivaji Nagar is a perfect Hindi. The trouble is with the Hindi, with a certain kind of chauvinism that has entered and of which you get a taste in the Constituent Assembly. When Hindi speakers begin to think that they are the landlords and everyone else is a tenant, this mentality is what needs to be broken. But I would not allow this, I would not like to allow this tension to therefore make way for the dominance of English that continues in our country. I continue to believe that if language had a color and if language had some way of imprinting itself on your skin, then India of today would look like an apartheid country. We live in apartheid. It's a linguistic apartheid that we don't recognize.
Thank you. I'll have to mull on that. It's going to take a while, yeah. The other thing I wanted to say was, it must have occurred to a lot, but when you spoke about, in your demolition of this mechanism of democracy, you also mentioned that democracy was the way we know it now, the way we understand it as a recent phenomenon. Because for the Greeks, democracy only meant democracy among the patricians. There was no democracy for all the people. It was democracy among those who had land, is what we're talking about, no? That there is no level playing field, really, as long as we have this kind of economic disparity, lack of access to resources, lack of access to information. There is no playing field. So the sort of idealized democracy that we're taught about in the NCRT books, in our civics books, has to be dismantled.
I completely agree. I think what Baba Saheb said in the Constituent Assembly about one vote, that we have political equality in a system where there's deep social and economic inequality, that continues to be the most apt characterization of the so-called democracy that we have in a capitalist economy, patriarchal society, and a caste order. Within these three, democracy is always a very seriously circumscribed affair. And we need to underline it. We need to remind ourselves and everyone about this. And the ideal of democracy, therefore, would require dismantling of all these three.
My last question, and then I'm opening it out to the audience, has to do with you mentioned 3 or 4 times you mentioned non-human creatures or animals in nature. For me, that is extremely rich because it also connects with Vista's commitment to eco-justice and to joining the dots between the ways in which people live, the land on which they live, the food they eat, the food they grow, the food they eat, and subsequently their social mechanisms and political mechanisms. Could you speak further about that and why you mentioned it so many times?
I mean, one of the, suppose elephants had a community. Elephants come together, they find a system of voting, and they decide that the city called Bengaluru is a bit of a problem. It comes in the way when we have to go from the Western Ghats to this way. Let's demolish it. Do they have the right to do so? Or we would be appalled, we would laugh at this idea. Are we not doing exactly the same? On this earth, there are so many creatures, one of which, us, happen to have this thing. We have come together, we have colluded in this lovely thing that we call democracy, looked at from the eyes of the great Indian bustard, would look like a conspiracy. These fellows have come together. They have decided amongst themselves that I should be finished. Who are you to decide that? So there's a deep moral question. And moral question also about future generations. Who are we to decide whether children born tomorrow would have decent air or not? We are deciding that. As I said, people in my village have drunk the water for the next 7 generations. I mean, what gives us the moral right to do so? That's one part of it. And secondly, even if you put the morality aside, suppose we were not to care for nature, we were not to care for any other species. This is a pure act of suicide that we are committing, And I honestly do not see normal mechanisms of democracy with the most perfect election taking place in the most level playing ground. Remember, it's level for me and you, not for elephants, So in the most level playing ground, I cannot imagine it would produce just outcomes which would not lead to collective suicide by human beings. And we have to have provisions that prevent us from committing collective suicide or prevent us from killing those who are not born yet. We have to have safeguards. Otherwise, democratic mechanism will never really do this.
For that, we say thank you very much. I believe you yourself are on a path of wisdom and you are leading us, pointing us to that direction of wisdom. So thank you and travel well. The very best in your campaigns, in your work, wherever you are. We have in our